Well, it's early September, and in North America at least, that means that it's time for some football. Usually this time of year, when I've got a free spot in the schedule, I try to review a football title. It just seems right. And so far on the channel, I've taken a look at games from some of the legendary football series that got their start in the 16-bit era. Joe Montana football, John Madden football, and even Bill Walsh college football, which still lives on bigger than ever with the recent triumphant return of EA Sports College Football 25 on modern consoles and PCs. But there's one series that I haven't looked at yet that dates back further than any of those, even if you include the original John Madden Football home computer release. And that would be Japanese developer and publisher Tecmo's foray into the pro football world, which began with Tecmo Bowl. And you might be wondering, hey, wait, I remember Tecmo Bowl on the NES, but I thought it came out well after that. And, well, you'd be right, however, the real original Tecmo Bowl was not the NES version, but actually an arcade machine from December of 1987, back when non-football fans knew John Madden from his Miller Lite commercials rather than a video game series. However, I should probably pause for a second, because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are confused because when you think of Tecmo, you think of girls in bikinis playing volleyball or Ninja Gaiden, but probably the girls. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where the only volleyball games I'll be reviewing don't involve boob physics. Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. Now that you've gotten over your disappointment that this video won't feature any soft porn, and keep in mind I'm not judging, but you can literally go anywhere else on the internet for that, let's start talking about the actual subject of today's video, and that is Tecmo Super Bowl for the Genesis, which was released in November of 1993 just in time for Christmas and Super Bowl 28 the following January. Now, of course, there were a few different versions of Tecmo Bowl, with the game actually originating on the NES in late 1991 as the follow-up to the original Tecmo Bowl. You know those crazy videos on the internet of someone selecting the Raiders and then running unstoppably all over the field with Bo Jackson to the point where a single run eats up an entire quarter? Yeah, that was from the NES version of the game, not the Genesis or Super Nintendo for that matter. Sorry to disappoint you if you were expecting to see that ridiculousness today, and honestly, as amusing as it is to see as a novelty, I think it's actually a good thing from a game perspective that that's been fixed. So, what actually is present in this version of the game, and how has it changed from the NES version, which was already arguably the best football game in the world, and clearly the best football game on the platform? Can it compete with its contemporaries on the console, which at that point were Madden 94 and NFL Football 94? Or is Tecmo Super Bowl in its 16-bit incarnation a tale of too little too late? Well, we shall see, but first a look at this golden package.
And here's my copy of Tecmo Super Bowl. This copy is pretty nice. It's not perfect, but it's been well maintained, with really the only noticeable issue on the outside cover being that the hang tab was removed from the top of the case. The inner cover looks fine with no sun bleaching or water damage, but there is some edge wear and indentation marks over the holes in the case, because that gold print is just completely unforgiving. Some of these Tecmo sports titles on the Genesis can get a bit expensive due to being hard to find, but that's not the case with Tecmo Super Bowl, and if you want a copy in similar condition for yourself, expect to pay between $15 to $20 for it. Pro tip, if you are a bit of a collector or just happen to see a copy of Tecmo Super Bowl 2, Tecmo Super Hockey, or Tecmo World Cup for cheap, pick them up because they're somewhat uncommon and definitely worth more than your average sports title. As far as the front cover goes, there's some things that I like about it, but I've got some issues too. I love the gold background with the blue font. It makes the logo really pop at the top. And I like the fact that they went with a photo cover of a player in full Dallas Cowboys regalia, just to show you that you can play as real NFL teams, because not everyone would get that from the Team NFL licensing logo down below. But at the same time, it contrasts really in a bad way with the Genesis red band formatting on the side, and just in general, it would look far better without it. And in case you don't believe me, here's the Japanese cover, which, shockingly, I know, looks much better without that red banding. However, that's not the only difference, as the Japanese cover also, just in general, is much less cluttered. I hate this nonsense of putting text on top of the artwork. It's completely unnecessary. Leave that flavor hype text to the rear cover. If you're wondering about a European cover, well, I've got some bad news for you. Tecmo apparently wasn't down with the PAL regions, and exactly none of their Genesis titles were released in Europe, which is understandable as a US-based sports title would be a bit of a hard sell there. But I'm a little surprised that neither this nor Tecmo World Cup made it, considering just how popular this game was, and that Tecmo World Cup 93 was released for the Master System over there as a console exclusive. Flipping over the back, and, well, the Japanese version won again. Just for comparison's sake, regardless of if you can read the Japanese or not, look at how clean that layout is, with the screenshot standing out on that black bar. And now, look at the US version, where for some reason they decided to put both the game graphic and the Tecmo Super Bowl logo at the top right next to one another, because maybe you needed to be told twice what this game was. And then they completely ruin the hype text and the bullet points by making them completely unreadable with a giant American flag in the background. I'm as patriotic as the next guy, but this is not the place for the flag. Opening up the box, and the manual is in decent shape, and we've got a bonus, a handy-dandy quick reference card to get players up and running quickly. Tecmo Super Bowl is simple enough that you probably could get by with just on what's on this card, and we'll discuss that more in a bit, but the manual itself is nice and large and thoroughly explains all of the game's options and a lot of the various statistics that are present, which is nice, especially for someone who's younger or maybe doesn't follow football that closely. At the end, there's a team introduction section, which honestly is kind of a waste of space because all it really does is name drop the main stars for each of the teams, and I'd really rather have a list of the players with their stats, rather than just this fluff. Okay, that's the package. Let's get onto the road to the Super Bowl and see how far we can get. To talk about Tecmo Super Bowl in the Genesis, you have to talk about where Tecmo Super Bowl originally came from. As mentioned, you can trace the origins of the series back to the arcades, where Tecmo Bowl made its first appearance. But most people are probably going to be more familiar with the incarnation of Tecmo Bowl that made it to the NES and later the Game Boy. That game was a hit not just because of its arcade-styled simplified gameplay, but also the ability to play as real players, as the game had a NFLPA license, which was somewhat novel at the time. Keep in mind that the Joe Montana series wouldn't have NFLPA licensing until NFL Football 94, and the John Madden series wouldn't have it until Madden 95, almost 6 years later. The massive popularity of Tecmo Bowl meant Tecmo had to follow it up with a sequel, so they did, with the NES version of Tecmo Bowl getting superseded by Tecmo Super Bowl, which made its debut in December of 1991, almost 3 years after Tecmo Bowl. So how did Tecmo propose to improve upon things and get people to buy a game for a console that was quickly being replaced by machines from the new 16-bit era? Well, first, how about more NFL licensing? It was the obvious choice, but getting the official NFL licensing to go along with the NFLPA licensing now allowed for the game to feel complete, with gamers now being able to not just play with real players, but now also be able to play using their favorite team names and logos rather than just the city name that, wink wink, indicated which team you were playing as. Sure, names and logos are a small change in the grand scheme of things, but the additional licensing also allows for conference names and the ability to use the name Super Bowl, hence the name of the game being Tecmo Super Bowl rather than Tecmo Bowl 2 or whatever else they might have gone with. If you're not aware, the NFL is fiercely protective of some of their trademarks, with the Super Bowl being one of their crown jewels, to the point that when people throw Super Bowl parties or bars advertising for watching the Super Bowl, they can't actually advertise the event as a Super Bowl gathering. They have to say, "Come here to watch the big game," or "We're having a big game watch party." So Tecmo being able to put Super Bowl right there in the title of the game really adds some legitimacy to the title. But you can't play a title to a video game, so what else did Tecmo add to the game? Well, how about actually having all 28 NFL teams that existed back then, as opposed to just the 12 that were included in the original Tecmo Bowl? I'd say that's a pretty big step up. And now with every team being included, along with the NFL licensing, Tecmo enhanced the existing season setup, with there now being a full-blown 16-game season with playoffs, giving you the end goal of winning the game's namesake Super Bowl. For a football game in 1991, Tecmo Super Bowl was incredibly mature in all these additions, including an overhauled play calling system that I'll get into more in a bit, led to Tecmo Super Bowl again being wildly popular and selling many truckloads worth of copies. There's just one problem here. Everything I've discussed so far applies to the NES version of the game. Last I checked, this was not and will never be a Nintendo review channel. In fact, I'm a bit revulsed just by thinking about it. What we're reviewing here today is not the NES version of the game, but the Genesis version of the game, which didn't come out in December of 1991. No, it came out 2 years later at the end of 1993. So, what changed in that 2 years? What was Tecmo Super Bowl bringing to the table in its 16-bit era that it wasn't already on the NES? Honestly, not a whole lot. And you could argue that Tecmo Super Bowl was already an excellent product, so it really didn't need much tweaking, and I'd agree with that if the Genesis version came out even a year later. But 2 years later? That's a huge amount of time to pass when it comes to video games, especially since late 1993 was probably the Genesis at its apex, before development started to move towards the 32-bit consoles that would debut a year later. Now, I'm sure that there's some real Tecmo Super Bowl aficionados out there that can detail all of the minute differences between the versions of the games, but based on what I can tell, Tecmo Super Bowl on the Genesis is the exact same game as Tecmo Super Bowl from the NES from 2 years prior, with 3 changes. The Genesis version has improved, but very similar, graphics. It has rosters based on the 1993 season, with 1992 attributes, as opposed to the 1990 season, and the Genesis version allows for you to play simulations of the 1991, 1992, and 1993 schedules, or all 3, whereas the NES version, of course, only has the 1991 schedule. But other than that, this is the same damn game, which is great if you really wanted to play Tecmo Super Bowl on your Genesis, but if you wanted something a bit more advanced like a Madden or a Montana, this isn't it. One of the areas where this is a problem is with the gameplay. Now, I want to be clear, before the legions of Tecmo Super Bowl fans come destroy my channel, for a simple arcade-style football game that you can just pick up and play anytime, either against a computer or a friend, it's fine. But there is a lack of depth here, and the first place that manifests itself is in the control scheme of the game, which still essentially runs all game activities to just 2 buttons, with one exception. That exception is actually an important one because it has to do with play calling. I'll get more into the plays in a minute, but on offense, pass plays are called via the A button and run plays are called with the B button, and you essentially pick the play you want to run via one screen menu. But what about the C button? Well, apparently it can be used to run a 1-yard dive play, which is pretty useful for when you've got any kind of 1 yard to go situation or you're at the goal line. However, this one-off play isn't mentioned anywhere on that play calling screen, and you wouldn't even know that it was an option without having read the manual. Well, I'm glad that Tecmo found a way to make the third button useful here, even though they didn't do a real good job of publicizing it, and I'm actually wondering how many people out there have played the game for years and didn't know it was an option. There's another place in which they really should have found a use for it but didn't. On defense, before the ball is hiked, you get a chance to pick which player you're going to control. Pretty normal stuff. However, what about after the ball is hiked? Yeah, well, you better hope that you're making the tackle because there's no way to switch players after the ball is hiked. If the opposing team happens to throw the ball and your chosen player is nowhere near the action, well, all you can do is pray that the computer players are smart enough to make the tackle, and that's not always the case. And don't get me wrong, I understand the original design of the game was set up for the 2-button NES pad, so you had one button to smash when engaged to try to tackle the runner, and then one button to dive at the player. But on the Genesis version, there's a third button sitting right there. Why did they not modify the game to use that third button to allow you to switch to the player closest to the ball, like in other sports titles? This is exactly the type of change that should have been made in the 2 years since the release of the NES version, and somehow they missed it. Let's move on to play calling, which, as mentioned, is something that was taken directly from the NES version with no adjustments. When playing the game, by default, you're provided 8 plays, not including that dive play, with 4 being pass plays and 4 being run plays. It's incredibly simple, and I think for gamers that just want a quick hit of football without actually thinking about schemes and routes and all that sort of thing, it's fine. But for most players that actually know football, they're gonna want something that's more advanced. Switching between what the John Madden or Joe Montana series were doing at the time by giving players an actual playbook with formations and multiple plays in each to choose from, to only having 8 is a pretty hefty downgrade. Hell, some formations in those other games have more than 8 plays just by themselves. To be fair to Tecmo Super Bowl, each of the 8 slots of plays actually have 8 plays that can be chosen, if you want to customize your playbook, meaning that there's actually 64 total plays in the game. But the way it works is that each slot only has access to 8 specific plays for that slot. So if one slot has 2 plays that you want to run, well, you're out of luck and you're just going to pick one that you like. I like that they did at least include the option to customize your plays, but arbitrarily limiting which plays you can put where is just odd. And I'm assuming it's some strange programming design. But again, why wasn't it fixed in the 2 years from the NES version? The defensive play selection is even more awkward because rather than choose a specific defensive alignment and play, you're choosing one of the 8 plays that you think the other team is going to run on offense to defend against. Pick correctly and your defense will swarm in and get a tackle for loss. But otherwise, you'll have to choose if you want to try to go after the quarterback or possibly lay back and either cover a handoff or a pass. Now, I tended to always call defenses against pass plays, with the hope being that my secondary could take care of the receivers while I tried to get a sack, or perhaps cover the run while I was in the backfield, and that always worked pretty well, but it's not exactly great football strategy, and definitely leans more into the arcade action background of the game. Now, I know I've been a bit negative thus far, so let's try to go in a more positive direction. One of the things that Tecmo Super Bowl did well was not only that you could play as real players on real teams, but you could also keep real stats as you progress through the season. While some of the details for the stats were a bit lacking, for instance, the per-game stats only show who led the team in a few categories at halftime and at full-time, just the ability to see how players were progressing and competing with players on other teams throughout the season was pretty cool. However, those are the accumulated statistics. The players themselves also have their own ratings, meaning that without the need for difficulty levels, games against teams that weren't so good in real life were easier, whereas games against better teams are going to be much more difficult. For example, in my first playthrough of the game, I chose my favorite team, the New York Giants. The only problem is, with the game releasing in 1993, the players' ratings were based around how the teams and players performed in 1992. And the Giants sucked in 1992. I was still able to make the NFC Championship game somehow, but then the Eagles cleaned my clock and then went on to win the Super Bowl over the Bills. The poor Buffalo Bills can't even win the Super Bowl in a video game, apparently. Even though I wasn't able to win the Super Bowl myself with the Giants, I do appreciate the attempt at mixing realism with gameplay that was designed to be as all-inclusive as possible. The graphics are another element to the game that haven't changed a whole lot from the NES to the Genesis. But I want to be clear, they have changed, and the game does look better than the NES version, with better looking cinematics that highlight the big plays and other major events, better looking helmet logos, and of course a better use of color. Having said that though, it's still very Tecmo Super Bowl. The presentation, in-game and out, is exactly the same and just made to look a bit nicer. If graphics are your thing, Tecmo Super Bowl is not going to be appealing, especially compared to Madden and Montana. The graphics here are a hard thing for me to judge because certain things like the helmet logos do look great, and I've always liked the cinematics, as they're a very Tecmo thing as far as sports games are concerned. But it's hard for me to look at this and say, this is a 16-bit title. Like, I assume that there would be some performance issues if they tried this, but I almost wonder how close to these graphics could Tecmo have gotten if they developed this on the Master System rather than the Genesis. From a sound perspective, there's almost less going on than the graphics. There's bits and pieces of music that play during gameplay, and it's all fine, but none of it's anything to get excited about. All that music is limited to during games specifically, when you're in various menus looking at stats or the schedule or perhaps customizing your team setup. The game is dead silent. I almost thought something was wrong at first because of the total lack of audio, but no, it just didn't have any until you got into a game. What you'll probably notice more than the music is the sound effects, the hut-hut before hiking the ball, the thunks as players collide with one another and get tackled, and maybe the occasional touchdown call-out when someone scores. Just like the music, it suits the arcade nature of the game's action, but it's nothing special, and is only marginally improved from the NES version. This review score may well end up upsetting certain corners of the internet because Tecmo Super Bowl has a bit of a cult-like following, with versions of the game still being modded to this day with updated and otherwise custom rosters provided, tournaments across the country, and Tecmo themselves even released an updated version of the game for modern consoles called Tecmo Bowl Throwback in 2010, minus all the licensing. But if I'm being honest, as fun and admittedly addicting as Tecmo Super Bowl for the Genesis is, it's really just the NES version with a fresh coat of paint, and I'm sorry, but I expect more than that. While the NES version is clearly a 4 or maybe even a 5-star game, I could totally see the argument for that, in late 1993, there were simply better football games on the market. As a result, I'm giving Tecmo Super Bowl 3 stars. It's a great game, but its age was simply starting to show at the time, and with a sports title, having fun gameplay will only get you so far.
And that's it for Tecmo Super Bowl for the Genesis. Is it a great game? Sure. Is it fun? Absolutely, especially in 2-player. But is it better than NFL 94 or Madden 94, which came out at almost exactly the same time? Well, I haven't reviewed those two on the channel yet, so I suppose I can't technically say, but based on what I've seen so far, Tecmo Super Bowl needed to do more to compete, and it didn't. Although I'm hopeful that Tecmo figures it out for Tecmo Super Bowl 2 or 3, because clearly the base was here already. Next week on the channel, it's a game that, I've got to be honest, I'm a bit scared of. I've already reviewed the Master System version of the game, and while it was admittedly bad, I don't think it was as bad as everyone makes it out to be. It just takes some patience and memorization in the first level. But don't get me wrong, still totally bad. So now revisiting it on the Genesis is something that I'm completely not looking forward to because I really don't want to go through learning that first level again. Oh well, it looks like we're out of time for this week. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 253. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later!